catalyzing event. The elements are isolationism, the spirit of anti-immigration, and the Great Depression. There are many foundational energies operating in the United States which color our approach to the Holocaust, but within the limits of our time today, I'm only going to talk about those three things. The two foci, the isolationism and the anti-immigration spirit, created an environment in our country, an environment of reaction. A current that runs through all of this is a current of anti-Semitism, which carried great political and social weight. Put bluntly, anti-Semitism in America, especially from the latter 19th century forward, was relatively strong as sort of a parallel to that in Western Europe at the time of the Dreyfus Affair and forward. The debates that occurred in the American Agora frequently mentioned different groups, such as the Jews, but in the American political discourse, they were rarely mentioned. The individual groups were not mentioned. For many in Congress, Republican and Democrat, avoiding mention of the Jews meant avoiding unwanted attention in the media. FDR's reticence was based on his desire to get the New Deal approved, secure re-election, and maintain congressional support for the Neutrality Acts, by which he hoped to assist the Allies against Hitler. Additionally, and this is no small thing, the Germans owed the U.S. a war reparation payment of $2 billion, and that's in current, not in 2018 dollars, that's back in 1930s dollars. Administration protestations against Nazi behavior was generally couched in language that did not include provocative words such as Jew. American isolationism. The isolationists had a great influence in Congress prior to December of 1941. A Gallup poll taken in mid-December of 1941 showed that 99% of Americans were very ready to engage in a war against Japan and, to a lesser degree, Germany. Americans wanted little to do with the Second European War before that. Among the key isolationists in Congress, and these are names that should ring familiar, Senator Burton K. Wheeler, Representative Maury Maverick, Senator Hiram Johnson, and Senator Gerald Nye. Two influential scholars of the period, Richard Brightman and Alan Lichtman, maintain that in the years before the U.S. entered the war, FDR often backed down on proposals to aid European Jews and other refugees in order to avoid confrontations with isolationist congressional elements that could put his priority political programs at risk. Such conflicts might have hampered his efforts to enact the multiple phases of his economic recovery program and later his efforts to revise the Neutrality Acts, the one that had been passed in 1935, 36, and 37, in order to provide, quote, nations resisting Hitler's aggression by all means short of war. Roosevelt never lost focus on his political goals for the nation and would avoid confrontation to maintain those ends. For many Americans, the story of our country is a haven for the oppressed. We're a nation of immigrants. Immigrants were generally welcome for what they could contribute to America, and until the late 19th century, there was virtually no limit on European immigration. Beginning in the latter years of the 19th century, however, members of patriotic and nativist groups, fearing the impact of, quote, hordes of aliens, end of quote, might have on the American economy and on the American society, lobbied for more restrictive immigration laws. The intention of the new laws was to keep the nation white and Protestant. By the early 1920s, restrictionists succeeded in passing legislation, most notably the National Origins Immigration Act of 1924, commonly referred to as the Johnson-Reed Act, which virtually cut off immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. The legislation established quotas for immigrants from countries in Southern and Eastern Europe based on 2% of the members of these nationalities who had been in the United States per the 1890 census. Although the National Origins Act did not single out Jews specifically, and no U.S. law did, the way in which the quotas were constructed, the act had a major impact on Jewish immigration. According to available data, 119,036 Jewish immigrants arrived in the United States in 1921, but only 10,292 were admitted in 1925, the year after this Immigration Act came into play. Some of this came from nativist desires to maintain American demographic profile as a Protestant Northern European model by minimizing immigration from Mediterranean and Slavic areas. From 1924 until 1960, total immigration in the United States was capped at 150,000. Quotas from Western and Northern Europe remained essentially unchanged. Those impacting Eastern and Southern Europe were reduced by a factor of 9. The African immigration was reduced to a total of 1,100 quotas for the entire continent, and there were 0 quotas available for Asians until after World War II. As an aside, and an important part of this discussion is the United States did not have a refugee policy. It only had an immigration policy. And all persons trying to escape the Nazi regime were treated as immigrants, and the speed of the bureaucratic process never accelerated to accommodate the escape from those in danger. As anti-immigrant sentiment grew stronger with the onset of the Depression, as people worried that immigrants would take jobs away from native-born Americans, in September 1930, President Hoover mandated stricter enforcement of an existing codicil in a 1917 law called the likely to become a public charge phrase. The LPC provision of the 1917 Act had not been enforced, but when the onset of the Depression caused Hoover to demand the enforcement of that act, and then prospective immigrants would then have to prove that they had sufficient funds to support themselves for a year, or they had friends and relatives who would declare that they would support them financially if they could not get jobs in the United States. The policy change severely reduced the number of eligible immigrants who could be admitted under the established quotas. Thus, by the time Hitler came to power in January of 1933, America already had restrictive immigration laws, and they had been further tightened by these new regulations like LPC. As the crisis intensified in Germany and as Nazi rule extended over much of Europe, Congress proved unwilling to liberalize the immigration laws or to agree to rescue measures that would have admitted refugees in imminent danger beyond the statutory quotas. The Great Depression hit the United States like a Mack truck, shocking the nation and staggering the economy. The conventionally accepted unemployment figure for the Depression is 25%, but if the farm labor is stripped out of the calculus, that number had sometimes exceeded 47% unemployment. It also served as a catalyst. The Depression forged a legislative alliance between the forces of anti-immigration and the forces of isolation. In this environment of economic extremists, Hitler and Roosevelt both captured the supreme office of their respective nations, one intent on solving an economic collapse and the other intent on restoring Teutonic hegemony. For FDR's part, his focus was on relief of the miseries of the Depression. His overweening priority was the economic recovery of the country. True to his progressive roots, his recovery vehicle was the New Deal, the program of financial reforms, public projects, and federal programs, which were for FDR a sine qua non. His second priority was to remain in office long enough to see his New Deal through, and later to remain in office as the approach of another large European conflict became more likely. The New Deal was contentious, and Roosevelt had to marshal his considerable political skills to build and, more importantly, maintain the support required for his program. FDR would let nothing mortgage that effort. As the president was very aware of public spirit, and polls indicated that the electorate were consistently opposed to increased immigration throughout the 1930s and through the end of the war. A 1938 Gallup poll, right after Kristallnacht, Gallup conducted a poll. And this poll asked Americans if they approved of Nazi actions against the Jews and other minorities. 94% of Americans disapproved. The same survey poll was asked if the U.S. should increase immigration quotas, and 72% said no, they should not raise the immigration quotas. Adolf Hitler, for his part, was focused on restoring Germany's international position by righting the wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles, which would enable Germany to reclaim its rightful primacy in Europe. Hitler made no secret of the fact that his campaign would be racial, and that those identified as non-Aryan, including the disabled, homosexuals, communists, criminals, and other asocials, and most especially the Jews, were all obstacles that would be ruthlessly eliminated. Most of these targeted groups collided with the immigration barriers erected by the United States and most other Western nations because as Hitler was actively trying to evict the unwanted, the U.S. and most of the rest of the world was putting locks on their doors. Certainly America was not alone in erecting what David Wyman has called paper walls, but ours were some of the most difficult to overcome. For example, in 1939, the German Jewish population was approximately 588,000, just in Germany. Per the quotas mandated by the Reed-Johnson Act of 1924, 27,000 could be eligible to apply for an entry visa in the United States. And the projected wait time for that visa approval was 9 years. And applicants would have to revalidate their applications annually. And that was, in fact, the environment in which this America is going to conduct its response to the Holocaust as they become more and more aware of it going on. The first key actor we must talk about is FDR himself. FDR grew up in a well-to-do Protestant Episcopal family in Hyde Park, New York. He was raised to be concerned about others with no evidence of anti-Semitism that was, that was often apparent in upper-class Protestant circles. He attended private boarding school, Groton, then Harvard University and Columbia Law. He entered into the government as a progressive Democrat. He served as a New York State Senator and Assistant Secretary of the Navy and the Governor of New York before he was elected president in 1932. FDR was a master politician, charismatic, very sensitive to public opinion, and also very sensitive to shifting political currents. As president, he preferred to delegate to various agencies to remain above the battle, while allowing and even encouraging competing factions within his administration to wrangle over tough issues. In many cases, it's difficult to know what FDR really thought about some issues that divided his cabinet, including the crisis of European Jewry. Because he didn't write much for memoirs, he left few letters or other records. He did not allow official transcripts of most cabinet sessions or note-taking at other meetings. There were few tape recordings of the Oval Office discussions. Therefore, Roosevelt's opinion remained a mystery that can best be discerned through the recollections of others. What is not mysterious at all are the political goals he set for himself in 1932. As mentioned above, it's difficult to measure the extent to which the president's public statements and policies reflected personal views on questions of Nazi oppression of Jews or other unfortunate targets of Hitlerite intentions. His actions speak more loudly. As president, FDR surrounded himself with official and informal Jewish advisors, including Samuel Rosenman, his principal speechwriter, Felix Frankfurter, who was an advisor that FDR later appointed to the Supreme Court, Henry Morgenthau, his lifelong friend who would become his Secretary of the Treasury and the chief architect of the New Deal, as well as others including Sidney Hillman, David Lilienthal, Isidore Lubin, David Niles, Herbert Lehman, and the list is long. Moreover, talented young Jews took advantage of the unprecedented new opportunities in many New Deal agencies. And to reflect the level of anti-Semitism that was extant in the United States, the visibility of the Jews in many of these new federal agencies caused them to label the Roosevelt administration the Jew deal. As Henry Feingold observed of FDR's method of leadership, including the issue of America's response to the Holocaust, it offers, quote, it offers some fascinating insights into Roosevelt's administrative style. It is replete with overlapping agencies and perpetual conflict, and with violent personal antagonisms, which can be traced to the president's uncertain mandate. The Congress, by the time Hitler came to power in 1933, America already had restrictive immigration laws, and that had been further tightened by those new regulations we discussed. As the crisis intensified in Germany, as Nazi rule extended over much of Europe, Congress proved unwilling to liberalize the immigration laws or to agree to rescue measures that would have admitted refugees in imminent danger that went above and beyond the quotas. Members of Congress who favored restricted immigration, a coalition of conservative Republicans and Southern Democrats, included Senator Robert Reynolds, Senator Rufus Holman, William Elmer of Missouri. A particularly outspoken advocate of isolation and restriction was Representative Martin Diaz of Texas. Though restrictionist sentiment was strong, congressional opinion was not monolithic on the immigration issue. As the situation deteriorated in Europe, some lawmakers, such as Representative Samuel Dickstein, Democrat of New York, Representative Emanuel Keller, also of New York, Robert Wagner, also of New York, and Edith Norris Rogers of Massachusetts, and you might sense a pattern here, sought to modify the quotas and introduce emergency bills to admit refugees who needed a safe haven. At times, those refugee advocates were hesitant to speak out, concerned that this would only result in a campaign to reduce immigration's levels further still, or even cut it off entirely. While the advocates generally did not succeed in increasing the number of refugees in the country, they were able to maintain existing laws and block the enactment of more restrictive legislation. Roosevelt was well aware of the restrictionist mood in Congress. and was reluctant to propose any measure that might be viewed as an effort to circumvent the immigration laws. In Henry Feingold's opinion, the president's deference to congressional attitudes and to American public opinion was actually an affirmation of the democratic process. Quote, in the case of rescue, Roosevelt wanted to do more, but doing so would have entailed a price he was unwilling to pay. It meant thwarting the very clear political consensus that Jewish refugees were not welcome. Ironically, Washington's failure in the crucial first phase of the Holocaust was a classic example of democracy at work. The Department of State had a long-standing reputation for elitism and bureaucratic management. Its conservative tone and club-like environment shaped its response to the refugee and rescue crisis. Richard Brightman and Alan Lichtman described the department's stance in the early 1930s, quote, under the influence of their own cultural bigotry and their commitment to non-intervention in the internal politics of foreign powers, the high officials in Roosevelt's State Department discouraged all protests, demonstrations, and boycotts against Hitler's persecution of the Jews. They resisted any presidential diplomatic rebuke of the Nazi regime, end of quote. But I would ask you to recall that there was still a $2 billion reparation bill out there that they were very concerned about. Later in the crisis, State Department action proved inaction on the rescue front and even obstruction of rescue efforts led to struggles with both private rescue advocates and other executive departments. Ultimately, Treasury Department officials, frustrated with the State Department's intransigence, succeeded in removing the refugee rescue crisis from State Department control. Several prominent State Department officials were opposed to refugee aid and rescue proposals. In 1920, while serving as the director of the Consular Service, Wilbur Carr's memo to Congressman Albert Johnson of Reed Johnson fame, chairman of the House Committee on Immigration, had mobilized support for the more restrictive Emergency Immigration Act of 1924. Carr later served as Assistant Secretary of State from 1924, and in the 1930s, based on documentary research by Brightman and Alan Kraut, both Carr and William Phillips, Undersecretary of State from 1933 to 36, were strong restrictionists with demonstrated anti-Semitic opinions. Carr and Phillips reflected the sentiments among many of the senior career Department of State cadre. Other members of the department, according to David Wyman, sought to suppress information regarding the final solution in May of 1943. Many other mid-level State Department officials were, in Wyman's evaluation, quote, indifferent to the tragedy of European Jews, end of quote. And Breckinridge Long, whose picture you saw on the first slide, was the Assistant Secretary of State for Special War Problems, a highly ambitious individual with an avowed nativist and probably anti-Semitic views, who exercised control over America's visa administration during the most critical years of the crisis. Almost single-handedly, he devised administrative procedures that drastically reduced the number of immigrants who could enter the United States, even within legally established quotas. The Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, might have provided more effective leadership for the Department on refugee matters. Some, knowing that his wife was of Jewish origin, hoped that he would do so. Wyman notes that Hull did speak out publicly against Nazi anti-Jewish persecution. However, like his boss, FDR, he was cautious. He avoided controversial issues and would not consider any proposal that might interfere with other principles, such as not intervening in the internal affairs of foreign nations and preserving free trade agreements. For the most part, he left the refugee rescue decisions to his subordinates, especially Breckinridge Long. Within Roosevelt's cabinet, there were competing voices on the refugee and rescue issue. Besides State, the Secretary for War, Henry Stimson, and the Assistant Secretary of War, John McCloy, were among those who tended to resist rescue proposals. Among the consistent advocates for a more compassionate response to the crisis were Francis Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, Harold Ickes of Interior, Francis Biddle, Solicitor General, and later Attorney General, and Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury. Morgenthau was a lifelong friend of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and had earned FDR's great trust by his successful construct of the New Deal. Morgenthau was a Jew who was acutely aware of the anti-Semitic currents in the American society, and he operated out of the public eye as much as he could, channeling FDR-approved funding to refugee and rescue efforts. one of the things that they did was they would license private agencies to use money abroad. In other words, foreign money transactions required Department of Treasury approval. And Morgenthau's staff ran that. In April of 1943, the World Jewish Congress presented a rescue proposal for Romanian and French Jews to the State Department. Treasury Department was involved, of course, because they are the licensing issue authority required to transfer the funds. Several young astute officials in Treasury Department's Foreign Funds Control Division, who had in fact authorized the license very quickly, became aware the State Department procrastinated in approving the required license. British opposition also contributed to the delay. After 8 months, Breckinridge Long, aware of the Treasury Department's serious concerns about the delay, finally approved the license to the World Jewish Congress to set up its blocked account in Switzerland. The delay caught Morgenthau's attention as a willful attempt to slow-roll aid to refugees, and he ordered his staff to investigate further. In the process of investigating the State Department delays, Josiah Dubois, Jr., the Assistant General Counsel for the Treasury Department, discovered that the State Department had also sought to suppress information about the final solution. In response to a communication from Gerhard Ragnar, who was an American, but he was used as a courier by rescue agencies. Folks in Europe would send Ragnar information about what was going on in Poland, Lithuania, and other places, and Ragnar had a channel to FDR where he could forward that information. The State Department didn't like the idea of a private citizen being able to get sensitive information of the president, and they issued cable number 354 to the American legation, to the American legations in Europe on February 10, 1943, and the message requested that you, quote, do not accept reports submitted to you to be transmitted to private persons in the United States unless such actions are advisable because of extraordinary circumstances. So it was a gag order. When Treasury officials asked State Department personnel about this cable, State tried to cover the evidence. Having revealed this and other State Department sabotage and deception, Treasury Department officials, including Dubois, Randolph Paul, the General Counsel, and John Paley, the head of the Foreign Funds Control Division, and Axel Lunford, brought all this data to the attention of Morgenthau. Dubois wrote up the group's findings in a scathing report, and I must mention that all of those gentlemen I just mentioned, except for the Secretary, are Protestant. The report was entitled, Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of This Government in the Murder of the Jews. Pretty strong title. The document claimed the State Department was, quote, guilty not only of gross procrastination and willful failure to act, but even of willful attempts to prevent action from being taken, end of quote. Despite his close personal friendship with FDR, Morgenthau retitled Dubois' document, quote, personal report to the president, and he, Paley, and Paul met with FDR on Sunday, January 16, 1944. Facing pressure in Congress, which had been aroused by debates over a couple of bills where State was trying to derail immigration improvements, and where Breckinridge Long had been caught offering misleading testimony to Congress, as well as a strong political possibility of a scandal over State Department's handling of this and other situations, the President agreed to establish a new executive agency devoted to rescue. On January 22, 1944, 1 week after the dramatic Sunday meeting with the President, he issued Executive Order Number 9417, establishing the War Refugee Board. The board's mission was to carry out, quote, the policy of this government to take all measures within its power to rescue the victims of enemy oppression, who are in imminent danger of death, and otherwise afford such victims relief and assistance consistent with the successful prosecution of the war, end of quote. The emergence of the war, WRB, the War Refugee Board, marked the beginning of a more promising chapter in the story of America's response to the Holocaust. As David Wyman notes, quote, the WRB staff's dedication broke America's indifference to the destruction of European Jewry, thereby helping salvage in some degree the nation's conscience. But note that the word Jew was absent from any official War Refugee Board language. John Paley from the Treasury Department, who you see on the far right there, was the named acting director and was later the director of the WRB. The agency was set up as an interdepartmental collaboration with Secretary of State Hull on the far left, Secretary of War Henry Stimson next to Hull, and Secretary Morgenthau, all participating in the WRB. Although it's important to note that with the exception of Morgenthau, the other three secretaries generally send a deputy. The WRB received limited governmental funds. Most of its funding came from private organizations, especially the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. The WRB's effect on U.S. policy was almost immediate. On January 25th, the WRB sent cables to American missions in Europe, as well as to top military commanders, instructing them to do everything that they could to assist Jews and others fleeing Nazi persecution. The WRB also strove to establish safe havens for refugees by establishing free ports in neutral countries, including Sweden, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Portugal, and Spain, and used their connections and funding to help the movement of refugees through those ports. Thousands of Jews also were rescued and accessed Europe through the use of protective passports or visa. An example you may be familiar with occurred in Hungary. A Jewish population in Hungary had been largely left untouched because the Hungarian government had wanted to persecute them themselves. But they had insulated them from the Nazis. But they became the primary targets of the Nazis in 1944 when the Nazis actually invaded Hungary. And in the spring of '44, Ivar Olsson was the WRB representative in Stockholm, secretly coordinated a series of meetings with the Swedish government to enlist the aid of a man named Raoul Wallenberg, who was a young Swedish architect and businessman, and asked him to become secretary of the legation in the Swedish mission in Budapest. With funding provided by the WRB, Wallenberg and his staff of largely volunteers saved at least 20,000 Jews in Budapest by giving them Swedish passports and placing them under Swedish protection in safe houses in Budapest. Beginning in mid-June 1944, the WRP received many appeals to urge American military commanders to bomb the railways between Hungary and Auschwitz, and if not that, then to bomb the camp's gas chambers and crematoria. The WRB followed a policy of persistent advocacy for strong Allied war crimes warnings that would, it was hoped, deter cooperation with Nazi policies against Jews. WRB staff member Josiah Dubois and Joseph Friedman drafted a statement that represented a significant policy shift for FDR, and FDR read it during a press conference on March 24, 1944. The statement included Jews among Axis victims and denounced, quote, the wholesale systematic murder of the Jews of Europe as one of the blackest crimes in all of human history, end of quote. The document also declared that the perpetrators would be punished, including those who participated in deporting the Jews. Moreover, the WRB staff managed to deliver food packages to people in occupied Europe, including concentration camp inmates, toward the end of the war, which contributed significantly to survival. They were all marked as Red Cross packages, assembled in New Jersey and shipped out of New York, and they were anonymous food packages, quite frankly. So in the final analysis, the WRB's, the good that the WRB did was they saved about 250,000 people, about 200,000 of them Jews, through its various programs. The general assessment is that the WRB accomplished a great deal, although its successes would have been greatly magnified had they been able to become operational earlier. The self-assessment of the WRB by themselves, however, is more somber. John Paley himself concluded, what we did was little enough. It was late and little, I would say. This is a complex issue, and it's one that still resonates today. The U.S. government had to wrestle with a number of critical issues from 1932 onward, and FDR put economic recovery as the first priority and would exclude everything that threatened it. A second issue for FDR was staying in office in order to see his political goals achieved, and he had to create a number of coalitions to make that happen. And his record is clear, and the unprecedented yet unstated intentions for 1936 were to complete the implementation of the New Deal, and in 1940 to try to steer America away from war while supporting the Nazi allies through a series of contentious neutrality acts. Finally, in 1944, he ran to see the war to its conclusion, an end he did not live to see. FDR's action post-January 1944, including the formation of the War Refugee Board, reflected his progressive and liberal roots, which were cards he frequently felt he could not play without jeopardizing his other legislative and diplomatic priorities. His realistic vision of what was possible certainly did not fail him in his response to the genocide in Europe. The Department of State has become a target of some withering and valid criticism for their collective actions regarding the refugee policy leading up to and during the war. Cordell Hull was of the classic school of diplomacy, in which sovereignty was an absolute concept, and his subordinates worked mightily, often at odds with the president, to steer an entirely neutral course to keep the United States out of the conflict in Europe. Much of their pre-1941 efforts focused on avoiding friction and animus with the Nazi regime, and they viewed aid to refugees as diplomatically provocative. However, as much as the diplomatic situation was turned on its head in December of '41, states' stance on immigrants and refugees actually became tighter, as fears of an immigrant-based fifth column were stoked by anti-immigration forces at Foggy Bottom, abetted by the War Department. Of all the members of the Department of State, Breckinridge Long is subject to particular vitriol among scholars of the period because of his documented efforts to stymie at every turn an increase in refugee flow into the country. It must be said, however, that Long made no secret of the fact that he intended to protect America from unchecked immigration, and that he would do so ruthlessly, a sentiment that rings valid with many Americans today. Long believed he was doing the right thing for the country, and although a personal friend of FDR, he was removed and demoted following the revelations of 1944. Henry Morgenthau was a friend of FDR and had earned his trust and loyalty, especially with his work as the design engineer for the New Deal. But Morgenthau's father, Morgenthau had history with genocide as a function of his father's ambassadorship to the Armenian in Turkey, and he witnessed the Armenian massacres in 1915. He saw some of those indicators of coming violence and tried to enable escape for the victims of the Nazi regime, but was, until 1944, essentially stymied in his attempts. As a principal advocate of the WRB, Morgenthau ensured that John Paley had his administration's imprimatur. He also worked, worth noting that Morgenthau would have liked to have seen Hitler's dream of Germany as an agrarian nation be realized, and promulgated the so-called Morgenthau Plan that would have stripped Germany of all industrial, that is, war-making capability, and be converted into an entirely pastoral nation. In the years up to and during the Second World War, the Roosevelt administration brought America out of the Depression and contributed mightily to the defeat of the Axis regimes. Perhaps the best we can do for those oppressed by the Nazis was to win the war and remove the oppressor. There. These are some of the signal works that are out there on this. There's new scholarship coming out on this. I think I hinted at that earlier on. That is more controversial. It'll be interesting to see how this discussion develops over time. But I did mention Brightman and Wyman a number of times. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my presentation. Thank you. Sir.
Check.
This is probably a bad question, but to go away from the home front and with the creation of Israel, what is America's foreign policy immediately with the creation of Israel? Do they follow through? It's like a too little too late policy, or is that just kind of?
Not a topic I'm thoroughly conversant with. Yeah, well, it's interesting because the British were complicit with the fellows at State and Breckinridge Long in particular, to try to slow things down. The British use economic arguments, and the British too had a national interest, a national colonial interest in keeping Zionists, Jewish people, from moving to Israel at the time. And so they too were working very, very hard to stymie any immigration to Israel. So it is a related topic. So, and the U.S. did very little to stop them. So we did not want to get involved in Britain's business. We're back to Cordell Hull, wanting to stay in our own sovereign national lane. Sir. Ma'am?
When you were talking about Germany owing us the $2 billion in reparations, were they actually paying that?
They were paying some of it. There were two hiccups. They had their first economic collapse in the 20s, And the second one, of course, was the Great Depression. They had tried to pay those. Hitler stopped paying them, and we basically forgave the debt after subsequently, Second World War. But it was, what it was a, the potential for keeping that money was one of the reasons that state was trying to keep the lines of communication open with the Nazi regime. There's also another thing that I didn't really touch on here, and this is the idea of unbelievability. People in the world didn't believe that anything like this could happen. It defied belief. And so a lot of the folks in State Department, I mean, they come out of this discussion not looking very good, but State Department was not monolithic either. There were folks in State Department that worked very hard to get refugees moving. Raoul Wallenberg would not have been successful without help from Department of State. So.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on the consideration of bombing the death camps and bombing the rail lines and why that didn't happen. And also, what was the familiarity within the US government of Mein Kampf and how that outlined some of the things that Hitler did eventually do?
Let me do the back end of that first. There was a group of Americans that were very pro-Nazi, and they, of course, were thoroughly imbued with, enamored of and imbued with Mein Kampf. They liked it and quoted it freely. But generally in America, the book was not widely read. Honestly, generally in Germany, it was not widely read until after 1933, which is something the Nazis didn't want you to know, but that's how that was. And the first part of the question again, sir? The bombing, this is a very complex issue. Should we bomb a camp full of prisoners that are helpless? Isn't that a war crime? That's one side of the discussion. The other side is the American policy at the time, the Allied policy at the time, was the best way we can help these poor people is to just win the war. And don't divert 1 calorie of war-making effort away from that single goal. And so when the arguments came up to bomb Auschwitz, which is the one that is the most contentious, they were generally shot down by the War Department. And the thing is, some of the arguments were specious. The airplanes couldn't range them, which was not true, because they bombed Buna, which is the rubber plant right next to Auschwitz III. And 2 of the bombs from that raid actually landed in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So yeah, you could range it, but the problem was the intelligence wasn't there. No one was really sure where Auschwitz was, what it was, and it looked just like a military installation. So it was hard to identify it. It's a very contentious issue. Folks are still fighting about that today, and free entertainment if you go to one of those talks. So. Is that it? Well, I thank you. Oh, sir.
What happened in Warsaw between September 1 of 39 and December 7th, 41? Did the U.S. have a consulate or embassy or something in Warsaw?
No, it was occupied territory at that time. It was part of the thing called the general government of the Reich at that point. And so it was occupied by the Nazis, then it was going to be occupied by the Soviets, then it was occupied by the Nazis again, and a lot of people died in there. But in Warsaw, beginning in 39, is an occupied city and never is not occupied by a foreign power.
The U.S. consulate closed, or what was there?
I couldn't tell you for sure. I know there's no U.S. representative there. Now, whether the building was still there or not, I couldn't tell you. But there was no U.S. diplomatic activity happening there that I've ever seen. So, sir?
How did information from inside the camps get to the United States? How did we know? I know they photographed some out of Auschwitz. How did we know what was going on?
The disbelief thing was a big deal. Nobody believed that this could happen. So you had to get past that first. But the way the information got out was inmates that had escaped or inmates that could get the information out would pass that. And there were all sorts of resistance groups, not really resistance groups, but communication groups. And they had communication rat lines that could move information. And they moved it through Switzerland frequently. And it would go from Switzerland to London and to New York. That's one way of getting it out. And there are a number of instances of that. Zingelbaum is one of the guys that moved information. Another famous name you may remember is Jan Karski, is another fellow that moved information. There's another part of that, though, and that is that British signals intelligence had figured out what was happening in the camps by spring of 1942 because they were intercepting the death counts. The Nazi camp commandants were jubilantly transmitting in the clear. Well, it was coded, but we'd broken the code, but it wasn't subcoded. They were touting their death count for the day, their body count for the day, and so by mid-spring 1942, everyone knows what's going on, and it comes out in the New York Times in June of '42, and it's in the papers after that a lot. Frequently, it's on page 14 below the fold because there's a lot of other things happening. You've got torch going on in North Africa and that kind of thing. Folks are interested in what impacts them. And then again, the disbelief factor fits into it as well. But there was a great information flow that was coming out of especially Poland. Sir?
Is there any relationship at all to the America First policy of the late 30s to the isolationism that is going on now in the current administration?
How about those Red Sox? They look very similar to me. They do, but it's all for the same reasons. People want to eat, people want to have jobs, people want to have a home. And what they see as the immigration for many people appears to be an existential threat, a threat to their, to their livelihood. And that's what they saw in the 30s as well. I mentioned Representative Diaz from Texas. There's a famous television clip that you can find on YouTube where he says, if we hadn't let in those last 2 million refugees, we wouldn't have a Great Depression now. Everybody'd have a job. Well, that's something that can relate to somebody that doesn't have a job. So to me, it's a very relatable, very similarly relatable experience. So, but that's just kind of how it looks from this foxhole. So, ma'am?
Did the Russians alter their war plans in connection with the knowledge of the Holocaust?
The Russians had no interest in saving Jews or anybody else. The Russians were angry that 3 million of their prisoners of war had been murdered. The Russians were angry that millions of their women had been raped and killed during Operation Barbarossa. Stalin uses that anger to fuel his soldiers' advances. So they have no political interest in saving anybody. And they've already shown in a numbers of battles that the value of human life is, probably operates in negative numbers. Having said that, they did in fact change maneuver plans at times. Auschwitz itself could have been liberated far earlier. But just as importantly, the 4 big killers were Chelmno, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. Those are the ones that killed most of the people. And Auschwitz we remember because it's Auschwitz. And we remember Auschwitz because it has a lot of survivors. But the ones that, when you got off the train, you went right to your death. Those were the 4 Operation Reinhard camps. The Soviets were never going to get to those at the time. They were too far in the rear. So, from a practical perspective, did the Soviets abet Hitler's genocide? I can't say that, but they did in fact change their plans a number of times to let people continue to kill themselves before they came in after. The most famous one, of course, is the Battle for Warsaw, where they halted across the river and waited for the Germans to finish killing the rebels in Warsaw, the communist rebels in Warsaw, because they thought they were too big for their britches. So, ma'am, back here. Sorry.
What are your thoughts on today's decimation of the Syrian rebels and the Syrian Kurds, and the world sits by and does nothing?
I'm sorry, I'm a little louder if you would.
What are your thoughts on today's happenings of the decimation of the Syrian Kurds and the Syrian rebels, being done, and the world just sits by and watches.
Well,
Does nothing.
The UN hasn't declared it a genocide, because if they declare it a genocide, there are now statutory things that you have to do. One of the reasons, remember when Secretary Powell declared the killing in Darfur genocide, and the rest of the world went nuts, because you know, once you do that, then there are UN requirements for nations to now take specific actions. And so the UN's very hesitant to call something a genocide, but they are calling it mass atrocity, mass crime, and they have used other terms that you know, but they have not used genocide in that yet. So, but sure looks like it to me, because the definition is identified by one of 4 items, and with the Kurds you could use either religion or nationality. So.
When the U.S. Liberated the concentration camps, was there a standard policy for dealing with the survivors?
That's very interesting. The first thing that happened was General Eisenhower felt it was extremely important to document all the camp liberations, because he was very afraid that at some future date someone would try to deny that it happened. So there's a very strong, still moving and written record of all the liberations. There was no standard thing at first, Tom. We overfed the prisoners and it killed them. We just didn't know what to do with people that weighed 70 pounds and less. We didn't, and so the Brits were really good at killing them too, the same way, overfeeding them. Up in, you know, so the doctors on in both countries, and the French doctors as well, all got together and developed over time a regimen that would allow them to make it back into into a more healthful mode. But it took a while. It probably took about 3 months, I'm thinking. It wasn't until fall of 45 where the DP camps came in with a like, for lack of a better term, a standardized staff would fall in on the DP camp, and then they would operate accordingly. So.
Right before 1950, so it'd be 48, 49, there was a huge influx of other groups other than Jews.
Into here.
Well, into the United States. And I'm thinking particularly about the Hungarians that all ended up in Indiana, particularly northern Indiana. Several thousand, and the state was split as to whether they should be there or not. But after the war, as I remember, they were all refugees. And I think they came primarily with support from Christian groups, religious groups, and so forth. Is that absolutely separate from what our government was doing?
No, I didn't get into it as a function of time, but you bring up a great point, because what we're talking about is what happened next. Well, what happened next was the War Refugee Board was only the first step. The U.S. developed a refugee policy. In the refugee policy, you could be declared a refugee for humanitarian reasons, for political reasons, a number of different reasons. And just as the War Refugee Board was largely funded with private dollars, so too were many of these refugee actions post-World War II. We didn't have to fund them because so many Americans were willing to do it. Just like after Katrina, you know, we're willing to give money for what we think is a good thing. And as a, you know, an inherently generous nation, there was not really a shortage of funds. It was a shortage of getting the administrative paperwork to go. It's interesting to note, though, there was one group of Jewish teenagers. They were children, actually, when they were brought to the United States just prior to the onset of World War II, and they went up to in upstate New York. They had an interesting status, though. They weren't refugees. They weren't immigrants. They were brought in on a document that called them personal guests of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They're his personal guests, and they set up their own. They set up their own high school and everything else. And after FDR died, President Truman didn't know what to do with them. So he finally, in 1946, said, "Yea, verily, you can go out and be Americans now." So Not quite that way. They issued them entrance permits, and they were able to leave the grounds that they were on. But it was an evolutionary thing that we got to in terms of that. But I think the Hungarian example is a great one.
All right, I guess I get to ask the last question, Dave. And you showed your hand by slipping through your slides there. So can you go back and talk about the NV St. Louis?
We can talk about the St. Louis. The St. Louis, it's the one on the left. The St. Louis, has anybody heard of the St. Louis, this case? Okay, a few of you have. On May 1939, I'm going to read to you again, I'm sorry. On May 1939, 937 Jews set sail from Hamburg aboard the MS St. Louis, bound for Havana. The St. Louis was commanded by Captain Gustav Schroeder. Of the 937 passengers, only 22 had Cuban immigration visas, but the rest had all purchased Cuban landing cards, which would allow them to remain in Cuba until their U.S. visa was issued. These individuals were all on the waiting list for a U.S. visa. Cuba had begun, like a small cottage industry, if you will, of allowing temporary haven for Jewish refugees awaiting visas for either the U.S. or Canada. If you could prove that you were on the waiting list, Cuban officials in Germany would issue the landing cards, generally at exorbitant rates. The landing cards were, in essence, temporary visas, and the Cuban motivation to allow this was twofold. First, the government charges local merchants and service providers, that is, hoteliers, could gouge the escaping Jews with impunity. And second, and more importantly, the Cuban government suddenly received a reduction in its sugar tariff to the United States. Some 5,000 to 6,000 German Jews had escaped Hitler's regime in this manner. In May of 1939, however, a reaction among anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi elements in Cuba caused the Cuban government to halt the practice of allowing issuance of landing cards to Jews. And when the St. Louis anchored off Havana Harbor on the 27th of May, the landing cards were canceled, except for the 22 passengers who had already acquired Cuban visas. All the others were caught in a diplomatic trap. Negotiations went on for several days, but were fruitless. Captain Schroeder was compelled to leave, he was forced to leave Havana. The diplomatic efforts were just ongoing and energetic, people trying to find a safe haven for these people. Several alternatives were tried and failed. The captain sort of dug holes, just did circles in the ocean, trying to waste as much time as he could so that we could get a diplomatic solution. And NGOs and U.S. officials, especially Secretary Morgenthau, continued to seek solutions. One option was the U.S. Virgin Islands, but elements in the State Department made that working concept public and declared it illegal, and FDR and his revisions to the Neutrality Act were at risk, so he waved Morgenthau off. Again, back to the original thing. He's not going to risk his Neutrality Acts. In the event, the solution was found to land the refugees in the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and Great Britain. Different amounts of refugees at different places. Which at the time, because Western Europe was not invaded at the time, were all perceived as safe havens. Poland had yet to be invaded. The U.S. and other involved nations believed that they had found a solution. Unfortunately, some 300 of those 900 would end up killed in the death camps because they would be deported from Belgium or Holland or wherever. The story of the St. Louis has become mythologized, and some additional context is helpful. Certainly, Department of State was against this because they saw it as a potentially provocative move that would irritate the Germans. And in the spring and summer of 1939, we're still not at war with the Germans. In the view of the department, they were performing a great service to the nation by maintaining a stay-safe diplomatic distance. The many NGOs involved, most of them Jewish, were not monolithic and all had different end states in mind. And I guess I'd end it with just saying, we talk about St. Louis some more, but Jewish organizations in the United States didn't agree on a way ahead. The American Jewish Committee did not want to provoke anybody. They didn't want to say the word Jewish. They just wanted to quietly put money and other resources against rescue efforts, but they wanted to do it quietly. The American Jewish Congress, on the other hand, was far more energetic and forceful and wanted to do different things. And so there was not a unified message coming from the American Jewish community, which was evident in the negotiations around the St. Louis. Frequently, at the negotiating table, the American Jewish representative groups would argue with each other, which was not helpful, and thus the St. Louis. Okay, folks, thanks very much. I do appreciate your time.